Paris never truly sleeps. Its heartbeat hides in the quiet places. In the tick of a clock, the shuffle of shoes across polished marble, the faint hum of electricity stitched through museum walls. But last night, inside the Louvre, the heartbeat faltered. Bonsoir, my late-night confidants. You've returned to Somnolent Conspiracies, where every solved riddle invites 3 new shadows to sit closer to the light. Tonight, I want you to stand with me at dawn in a hall that knows more history than any book will confess. The antique pendulum clock in the reception room, proud, punctual, and vain, stumbled 37 times in one night, and each silence exactly 7 seconds long. As if time itself kept taking a breath it didn't want anyone to hear. The guards called it a malfunction. The curator called it a shame. But when the tourists pressed their noses to glass that morning, something else was missing. Not a second, not a minute, a painting. One that had survived wars, thieves, and sermons about security. Gone without a splintered frame or a tripped alarm. So follow Detective Émile Durant as he moves through corridors meant to be watched, not walked. The trail begins with silence, measured, deliberate, and may end with a truth Paris won't write into its history books. Part 1: The Louvre at Dawn. The first light of Paris did not so much arrive as it seeped, hesitant, into the city's heart. It slipped between slate rooftops, brushed the embankments of the Seine, and finally spilled like pale honey over the glass pyramid of the Louvre. The Cour Napoleon below still glistened from a thin night rain, cobblestones slick and uneven under the soft tread of early staff. Somewhere beyond the arcades, a single pigeon took flight, scattering the hush with the beat of its wings. Detective Émile Durant crossed the square with the steady pace of a man who had been here before but never for anything good. His breath rose in small white clouds that dissolved into the morning. A line from an old case file flickered through his head. This place remembers everything. He'd never known if that was meant to be poetic or a warning. Inside the reception hall, the air was cool and faintly metallic, tinged with the scent of polish and stone that had absorbed centuries of footsteps. The glass canopy overhead fractured the dawn into shifting planes of gold and shadow. Beneath it all, Gerard Valmont waited. The chief curator was a tall man, but this morning he seemed diminished. His expensive suit hung from him like it had been chosen by someone else. A silk tie, dark as a raven's wing, was slightly askew. Even his hands, usually expressive in their sweeping gestures about art, were still and tight against his sides. "Durant," Valmont said, and even the name sounded heavier than usual. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Durant gave the briefest nod. "You said it was urgent." Valmont didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the far side of the hall, where a solitary brass-faced pendulum clock stood within its carved wooden case. It was taller than Durant, its polished housing catching the light so cleanly it looked almost unreal. The glass panel at its heart revealed the slow, hypnotic arc of the pendulum, a golden blade swinging in perfect rhythm, or nearly perfect. Valmont stepped closer, producing a folded security log from his inner pocket. "Last night," he began, his voice lowering as though they were already being overheard. This clock stopped. Not once, not twice, 37 times. Each pause, exactly 7 seconds long. Durant's brow furrowed. "And yet it's running now." "Yes, perfectly. Too perfectly." Valmont's lips tightened. "You'll see why that troubles me." Durant stood in front of the clock, listening. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was steady, mechanical, but there was something strange. Each note seemed to fall with a muted weight, as though the mechanism was swallowing part of itself before letting go. He'd heard clocks that sounded proud, clocks that sounded tired. This one sounded cautious. "How was it discovered?" Durant asked. "One of the night guards noticed the silence," Valmont said. "He thought he was imagining it, until it happened again, and again." The system logs matched his account, 37 interruptions, each exactly 7 seconds. Durant traced a finger lightly along the edge of the brass casing, careful not to smudge the polished surface. Dustless, maintained with the precision of a relic, as befitted an 1890 masterpiece. Any tampering would leave signs, unless it was done by someone who understood not just clocks, but this clock. And, Durant prompted. Valmont's eyes shifted toward the eastward corridor leading to the Denon wing. The morning light barely reached there. The shadows pooled thick against the marble. And that, he said softly, is not the only thing that stopped last night. Durant straightened. Show me. The curator nodded once and began walking. As they moved across the marble expanse, the sound of the clock receded behind them, but Durant swore he could still feel its rhythm somewhere in his chest. 37 pauses, 7 seconds each. Not random, never random. Somewhere in the Louvre, a secret had been measured in silence. And whatever had done the measuring had known exactly what it was doing. Part 2, the empty frame. They entered the Denon wing at a measured pace, their footsteps softened by the long rugs that stitched the marble rooms together. Morning crews had not yet spread through this side of the museum. The hush was complete, as if the building itself were holding breath. Outside, Paris brightened. Inside, the light arrived only by permission, a pale wash filtering through tall windows bandaged with gauze-thin shears. Valmont led Durant past vitrines and stanchions, past the patient faces of Renaissance saints and the sly, exhausted eyes of courtiers who had learned to survive courts more dangerous than prisons. The gallery air smelled faintly of linen, varnish, and the citrus cleaner used by the night team. A velvet rope lay coiled like a sleeping serpent along the path to their destination. Here, Valmont said and stopped. Durant looked up and felt briefly the optical vertigo he always got when confronted with a crime that pretended not to be. A frame hung on the wall at eye level, grand and gilded, its corners sculpted with acanthus leaves and quivering ribbons. It was beautiful in that almost grotesque way the Renaissance had perfected, ornate, heavy, arrogant. It was also empty. No splintered wood, no torn canvas, no ragged edge of fabric clinging to a nail. Just a clean, shallow rectangle of paler wall where a painting had lived for decades, and now did not. The brass plaque below it still read in confident serif letters, Mona Bellini, circa 1492. Oil on panel. The museum's ghost of certainty. Durant approached and stopped just short of the barrier line. Don't touch, he reminded himself aloud, a habit from years of lonely scenes. He scanned. The hardware mounts at the back edge of the frame were intact. The microsecurity clip, the one that married the painting's wire to the mount and screamed if anyone touched it, sat open. Not torn, not forced, unclipped. The work of fingers that knew precisely how far to press without tripping a switch. The rope? He asked, nodding toward the coiled length on the floor. Valmont swallowed. We found it that way. It wasn't cut. The end slips. He stopped, embarrassed. It's meant to be removed by staff, in case of cleaning or events. Durant crouched, studying the red nap of the velvet. No stray threads, no scuff marks on the polished brass posts. Someone had taken the rope down, laid it carefully aside, done their business, and what? Put everything back except the art. The kind of neatness that gave him hives. He stood, letting his eyes make slow circuits of the walls. Cameras perched discreetly in the room's angles like special ops pigeons. Small black domes. The nearest lens faced directly across, capturing anyone standing where he now stood. Another camera down the corridor would have watched any approach. So why didn't I get a 3 a.m. panic call from your head of security? Durant asked. You'll see, Valmont said, his voice tightening. It's not straightforward. They walked into the guard station, a compact room fitted behind a mirrored panel that let staff observe the gallery while remaining unseen. The station smelled of coffee that had died twice. On the console before the monitor were yesterday's shift notes, written in the blocky all-caps of a guard named Jules. Durant clocked the pressure points in the handwriting, the slight hesitation before the letter R, the impatience in the S. Friction. Valmont keyed up the feed. We archive 12 days at full resolution, he said. This is between 2000 hours and 6 o'clock. The screen showed the gallery in greenish monochrome, time code ticking in the corner. For long stretches, Nothing moved except the infinitesimal shiver of pixels that meant the sensor was alive. Then, a guard's patrol at 2213, posture board, flashlight traveling the baseboards. A spider dared the upper right corner at 2306. An old joke in a new city. Midnight rolled past. Now, Valmont said softly. He clicked forward. 1 hour, 14 minutes, and 8 seconds. The pendulum clock out in the reception hall wouldn't be visible from here, but Durant imagined its body inhaling, its rhythm choking. On screen, the gallery shivered. Not a shake. Durant had seen footage distorted by tiny tremors, and that made lines roll, made angles flutter. This was different. The image thickened for a fraction. Light smudged across surfaces, edges fattened and then snapped thin again. 7 seconds of smear. Then the room was crisp, clinical, and empty as a held breath released. Durant's eyes narrowed. Again. Valmont jumped to 1 hour 33 minutes and 52 seconds. The same thing. A soft bloom of distortion that spread like a stain and then withdrew. 7 seconds. After that, the gallery returned. The velvet rope remained coiled where the night crew had left it. The frame still displayed its proud vacancy of paint, for now. Durant placed a fingertip on the screen where the blur had thickened most, as if pressing could make the image confess. Valmont advanced to 2 hours 11 minutes and 19 seconds. Another 7-second smear. Durant spoke without looking away. The log on the clock matches these exactly, Valmont said. Every pause, every resumption. They watched several more. 2 hours 29 minutes and 45 seconds. 2 hours 58 minutes and 13 seconds. 3 hours 21 minutes and 7 seconds. Always 7 seconds, an exact little grave of time. Durant had no patience for coincidences. They were usually lies the universe told to people who couldn't sit with patterns. At 3 hours 49 minutes and 2 seconds. Something different. The distortion arrived on schedule, a gauze thrown over the sensor. As it cleared, Durant leaned in. The velvet rope was no longer in place. It lay, as he had found it, folded onto itself like a shawl on a chair back. The frame still held its placeholder glow, that pale rectangle, but the fastidious tidying had begun. Durant rewound and played again, frame by frame. During the blur, pixels swam, meaningless. Then, on the 8th second, clarity. Rope down. No person captured performing the act. No hand, no sleeve, not even a shadow. Just cause and aftermath, the middle politely erased. Security grid? Durant asked. Door sensors? Floor pressure? Glass break mics? All nominal, Valmont said, tapping another monitor. Not a single alarm. The system logged the brief power dips during the clock stoppages as negligible, within normal variance. Normal variance, Durant thought, the two most dangerous words in any institution that believed in itself. He moved back into the gallery. The room had the stillness of a chapel that had lost its god. He studied the plaster under the frame once more. The paler rectangle spoke of decades without sunlight. The minuscule dust ledge at the bottom edge, the ghost of where the panel had hung, was crisp and undisturbed. Whoever had taken the painting had lifted it clean, without brushing the wall, without letting the panel kiss the frame on its way out. A practiced extraction, like a surgeon drawing a shard of glass from skin without tearing it further. Durant stepped aside and lowered his head until the frame's bottom molding was at his eye line. He waited. From this angle, the faintest scuff along the parquet near the wall revealed itself. A smear no wider than a thumbnail. Not a shoe. Too high shine for rubber, too off angle for a heel. He pictured felt pads beneath a low dolly, a sliding cradle designed for weight and silence. He liked thieves who respected craft. They were easier to predict. He stood and let his gaze travel the sightlines a thief might care about. Camera cone angles, reflections in cases, the way glass throws back a ghost of what it sees. On the far side, a slim vitrine presented a silver reliquary. In its mirrored back panel, the empty frame appeared as a distant golden door. Durant understood, with the right setup, a person could watch a room without being in its direct frame, read the gallery through the glass like a periscope. When to move, when to freeze, when 7 seconds could be a lifetime. Valmont hovered, unable to stand the quiet. "You know the painting's history, of course," he said, as if history would apologize for the present. "It was in Florence until the 1890s, then Paris. Attempted theft twice. Survived the war in a crate under a school outside tours. We've had it insured half its life. The press." He stopped himself, ashamed of the thought, then surrendered to it. "The press will eat us alive." Durant nodded as if to say they always do. He didn't care about headlines. He cared about the moment the canvas left the wall and became a thought in someone else's head. He cared about the mechanism that manufactured 7-second pockets of permissive darkness throughout a building where light was law. "Your cameras," Durant said, "are shielded against electromagnetic noise." "To a point," Valmont said. "We've hardened against common interference. But if this was unusual—" He opened his hands, helpless. Durant looked once more at the frame. The ornate carving made a game of light, throwing soft shadows that suggested movement where there was none. He imagined a hand in a gray coat sleeve reaching beneath, unclipping. He imagined the weight of a panel painted 5 centuries ago, wood that had swallowed time until time belonged to it. He imagined lifting it out and feeling nothing but relief, because the hard part was already done. The room had been prepared to forget. He went back to the guard station and asked Valmont to replay the interval between the penultimate and final blurs. At 4 hours 36 minutes and 28 seconds, the image smeared. At 4 hours 36 minutes and 35 seconds, clarity. The frame was still occupied. He advanced to 4 hours 58 minutes and 2 seconds, smear, and at 4 hours 58 minutes and 9 seconds, the wall wore only its pale rectangle. The painting was gone. In those 7 seconds, history had been persuaded to step aside. Durant's jaw tightened. "Pull every log you have, power draw by circuit, camera temperature, Wi-Fi noise, staff keycard pings, environmental controls. I want them cross-indexed by those exact timestamps." He tapped the console where timecodes glowed. "And I want Jules, the night guard whose notes I saw." Valmont nodded and radioed for the man to meet them in the reception hall. Durant lingered one last time at the empty frame, letting his eyes go soft. In the blur of peripheral perception, something else surfaced. The room's sound. Even in quiet, a museum speaks. Air systems, distant wheels, the whisper of fabric, the tick of a clock from some office where someone loves old things. Here, the quiet was full, dense, nearly tactile. He imagined slicing it with a blade. They retraced their path through the wing, past queens and martyrs, toward the open architecture of the reception hall. As they stepped back into its volume, the 1890 clock measured the space with its patient metronome. Durant moved to it like a moth finds a lighthouse. He studied the face, Roman numerals in delicate enamel, an elegant seconds dial nested like a pearl. His gaze slipped below to the pendulum's glass window. The brass bob swung with institutional confidence, its arc crisp. He leaned closer and saw where the housing's dust had been disturbed. A small, fine crescent where a fingertip had traced the edge to pry. At the base, almost invisible against the inner wall, a detail most visitors would never notice. A narrow channel used by the restorer years ago to hide wiring for a humidity sensor. A convenient artery now if someone wanted to add something else. Durant loosened the tiny brass latch and opened the window a breath, not enough to trigger alarms. He peered in and, under the pendant, saw the faintest suggestion of a scratch. No, a seat, where a sliver could have rested against the escapement to interrupt the beat. He closed the latch gently and straightened. "Your clock stopped on a schedule," he said, not as a question. "And every time it stopped, your cameras forgot to see." Valmont's reply was a whisper. "We didn't notice the pattern at first. We thought—" He flinched at his own memory. "We thought Jules was jumpy. Where is he?" "On his way." Durant glanced at the pendulum once more. Its swing looked almost proud now, as if time had survived an assassination attempt and would be insufferable about it for weeks. He stepped back. "I'll need your full cooperation," he said. "No PR moves without me signing off. No quiet conversations with donors. Whoever did this counts on a museum's instinct to protect its own image." That instinct is how you get robbed twice. Valmont stiffened, then exhaled. You have everything, he said. Everything. Footsteps approached from the far side, quick, uncertain. A man in a navy jacket and museum badge rounded the corner, hat in hand, eyes red in the way cigarettes and shame make them. Jules, the stitched name over his heart, said, though the embroidery was a lie, people were always more complicated than their names. Durant met him halfway, watching the way the guard's gaze skated past the pendulum, the way his shoulders sagged at the sight of Valmont, the way a confession battled the reflex to survive one's job. Jules, Durant said gently, you were here when the clock went quiet. The man nodded. Yes, sir. Good, because we have questions the clock won't answer. Durant gestured toward a quieter corner of the hall. Walk with me. As they moved, the pendulum's tick receded behind them, but Durant felt each swing the way a fever patient feels the pulse in their wrists. The beat was steady now. That only meant someone had learned how to make it falter when they wanted it most. He pulled a slim notebook from his coat pocket, thumbed to a fresh page, and wrote 4 words that would anchor his morning. Stops equals access equals intent. He underlined intent twice. Then he looked at Jules and said, tell me everything you heard when time went missing. And Jules, blinking hard, voice already not trusting itself, began. Outside, the pyramid brightened. Inside, the detective's world narrowed to the geometry of a face, the echo of a sound, and the quiet certainty that someone had measured this theft not in footsteps, but in seconds. He would need to listen differently. Part 3, The Pendulum's Message. Durant postponed the full interview with Jules by 10 minutes, a small mercy disguised as procedure. Walk the perimeter, he told the guard, and write down the exact places you stood when you first noticed anything odd. No summaries. Landmarks. Jules nodded, grateful for a task that kept his hands busy. Durant returned to the clock. The 1890 case had the sort of vanity that invited fingerprints. Polished wood, a lacquered brass bezel, a glass window so immaculate it turned the museum's ceiling into a soft watercolor. He stood off-center, so his own reflection wouldn't overlay anything that might matter, and let the sight settle. Dust tells the truth when people do not. Along the upper edge of the bezel where the glass met the brass, the fine powder from a week's worth of air currents lay untouched, except for one crescent-shaped smudge, no larger than a coin, interrupted by a faint ridge pattern. He angled his head. Not a palm, not a smear from careless cleaning. A single fingertip kiss, precise as a note on a metronome. Whoever touched the clock did so once, and exactly where leverage and discretion meet. Do you want a tech team? Valmont asked behind him as if offering absolution. In a minute, Durant said. He slid on thin nitrile gloves, pale blue against the brass, and lifted the tiny latch he had examined before. The glass panel opened with a soft exhale. Inside, the pendulum assembly gleamed, brass rod, polished bob, the escapement above ticking away with fussy 19th-century pride. On the inner ledge, near the slot where a restorer had hidden sensor wiring years ago, something thin and metallic lay like a fallen eyelash. Durant breathed out slowly. He drew a slender pair of tweezers from his pocket field kit, a habit formed from a career of finding what others left behind, and teased the object free. A sliver of brass, no longer than a paperclip and half as wide. Its edges were deburred so it wouldn't scratch. One side bore hairline etching, numbers unevenly spaced along its length, shallow enough to escape a casual glance but deep enough to catch the light at an angle. He held it near the pendulum's path without touching the mechanism. The placement was obvious once you knew what you were looking for. If slid into the narrow throat of the escapement at just the right moment, it would arrest the beat without scarring a tooth. When removed, time would resume, none the wiser. No brute force. No jam that left but metal and angry technicians. This was surgical, a pause button engineered for a very old heartbeat. Can I? Valmont began, leaning in. Durant tilted the sliver, letting the light skim its face. Look, don't touch. He angled the etching toward him and read the first mark. 114. The second sat further along the strip. 133. He felt the click of recognition before the thought completed. The times were not symmetrical. They matched nothing a clock would choose for itself. He glanced at the security printout still folded in Valmont's hand. "You said your log has the exact pauses?" Valmont offered it over. Durant unfolded it with his free hand, eyes traveling the columns he had already memorized, 37 entries. Each a 7-second failure, starting at 1 hour 14 minutes and 8 seconds. He aligned the first etched number on the sliver with the first line on the page. 114. Next hash, 133. The log. 1 hour 33 minutes and 52 seconds. The spacing was not linear. The increments between etchings widened and narrowed like breaths before a plunge. He ran his gaze down the brass until 211 caught the light. The log offered 2 hours 11 minutes and 19 seconds in reply. "They match," he said. Valmont's mouth opened, then closed. "But how? Who would know how to?" "Someone who understands this clock's appetite," Durant said. He turned the sliver over. The reverse was blank, the metal faintly scuffed from a surface it had pressed against. "And someone who understands people's, too." He could see it. A technician, or a very convincing imitation thereof, passes as routine maintenance after closing. Panel opens. A sliver slides into the channel. Its tiny lip mates with the escapement seat like a key rotated to just shy of the click. The operator need only introduce a minute magnetic nudge at the right second. Through the case, with a coil no larger than a cigarette pack, to make the pallet lock against the brass tongue for exactly 7 counts of the guard's heart. A pulse of microcurrent, aligned to a separate metronome. One synced to the outside world rather than the clock's whims, and the pendulum is free again. Clean. Repeat. 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 He pictured the museum's systems as an ecosystem of dutiful machines, all calibrated to be trustworthy. A timed interference to the clock would look like a hiccup to the grid. A 7-second blackout at a camera during the same interval, microscopic within normal variance, would be swallowed by software designed to ignore noise. Someone had not only paused time, they had taught the building to dismiss its own memory. Durant brought the sliver closer to his face. The etchings were not stamped. They were hand-scribed. A craftsman's impatience peeked through in the shallow wobble of the 3s and the decisiveness of the 7s. He smiled, just a twitch. The human hand had told on itself. And if the hand had etched the times before the fact, this was more than improvisation. It was a score, a conductor's baton held to a city's narrow throats. He slid the brass into a small evidence sleeve, sealed it, and with the same motion tucked it into the inner breast pocket of his coat. Valmont watched the move and said nothing. Durant's glance, brief, razor-thin, had asked for his silence and gotten it. "Jules?" Durant asked. The guard approached, clutching his notebook like a life vest. Up close, his stubble looked like it had grown out of worry rather than biology, and the skin under his eyes had that chalky cast that fluorescent lights grant the contrite. I marked the places," Jules said, offering the notebook. "I also wrote the times when it felt wrong." Durant skimmed. The marks were not random. Jules's patrol path crossed and recrossed the reception hall at intervals that, when Durant overlaid them in his head with the clock's pauses, formed an uneasy braid. At 1:14, Jules had been exiting the Denon corridor. At 1:33, he was halfway to the Sully wing, where air pressure nudges at the doors are notorious. At 2:11, he was directly under the mezzanine where air handling vents whisper their lullabies. The places where small changes in air pressure and ambient hum occur so often that security staff grow deaf to them. A perfect camouflage. 7 seconds of silence in a building trained to forgive the occasional sigh. "What did you hear?" Durant asked, eyes still on the page. Jules swallowed. "The first time, nothing. That's how I knew something was wrong. The second time, a kind of press, like the air got heavier. You know when you take an elevator and your ears pop? Like that, but smaller. And then..." He hesitated, eyes darting to Valmont. "This'll sound stupid." "Say it anyway," Durant said. "I thought I heard metal. Not a clang. A kiss. Tiny. Like a coin leaning against glass and then letting go." Durant's gaze flicked to the clock case, to the bevel of the glass. He filed the word kiss away. Sometimes the adjectives that embarrassed witnesses were the only true ones. "And what did you see?" he asked. "Sometimes, nothing," Jules said, ashamed of the truth. "But at 3:49, I didn't see anyone move the rope, I swear. It was just there, and then after, it wasn't. And then..." He stopped again, and when he spoke next his voice put on the armor it needed. "I know what I saw, sir." "I'm listening," Durant said. "A man in a gray coat," Jules said. "Twice, in two different wings within seconds. Not running, just there." He looked at his hands, embarrassed. "I know that's impossible. I only wrote it down because I wanted to remember how I felt when I saw him. Like I was late to something I didn't know I was invited to." Durant felt a small, unreasonable flare of affection for the honesty of that sentence. "You're not crazy," he said. "You were outmaneuvered." He handed the notebook back. "We'll talk more." He turned to Valmont. "I'll need your conservator to pull the restoration notes for this clock. Every intervention since 2000. Every name who signed a work order. I want the electrician who ran the hidden sensor line. And your vendor list for horology servicing." "Of course," Valmont said, already dialing. Durant looked once more at the narrow channel inside the case where the sliver had hidden in plain sight. The trick had not been in stopping the clock. The trick had been in persuading everyone that the pause belonged to the building, not to a person. In museums, authority is a tone, not a badge. If you speak in the right tone, carry the right tool, wear the right coat, people see what fits and forget what doesn't. 7 seconds is a small price to pay for invisibility. He buttoned his coat, the evidence sleeve with the brass strip pressed against his sternum like a second pendulum. He could feel the numbers through the plastic, an absurd fancy, but it anchored him to the problem the way a sailor learns to feel weather in his joints. When machines lie, find the person who taught them to. "I'm going to need a specialist," he said. Valmont paused his call. "A specialist?" "A master of clocks," Durant replied. "Someone who knows how an escapement forgives, how a pallet hesitates, how brass sings when a magnet breathes near it." He took a last look at the clock's proud face. "Someone who can tell me how to make time stop without leaving fingerprints. Because someone just did." He pivoted toward the exit, the echo of the museum's heartbeat returning to its dutiful measure behind him. The day had warmed by a degree. Tourists would soon cone around the pyramid like bees to sugar. In a few hours, the museum would invent press language about resilience and investigations and redoubled security. But for the next hour, the Louvre belonged to the same thing it always belonged to when the stakes were real. A very old city's appetite for secrets, and the people who feed it carefully. Durant stepped into the pale light and dialed a number he had not used in 2 years. When a voice answered, sleepy, affronted, delighted all at once, he said, "Henri, it's Emile. I'm standing in front of an 1890 pendulum that kept choosing to be quiet for 7 seconds at a time. Bring your eyes. Bring your magnets. I'll bring the sin." He ended the call before the questions, slid the phone away, and felt the pitch of the day change under his feet. Time, he thought, is a better accomplice than any man if you learn how to bribe it. And someone had paid handsomely. Part 4, The Guard's Uneasy Memory. Jules stood just inside the cafe corner of the staff lounge, hands wrapped around a paper cup like it might cool the heat under his skin. The space was modest by Louvre standards, white walls, laminated tables, vending machines with stubborn buttons, but in the early morning lull, it felt almost too private. Durant took the seat opposite him, setting down his leather notebook and the evidence sleeve with the brass sliver. He didn't lay it out as a threat, just a presence. Jules's eyes flicked to it and then away. "You've been on night rotation for how long?" Durant asked. "For years," Jules said, after a swallow of coffee that scalded him. "2 in Sully Wing, then Denon. They moved me to reception detail last year." Durant nodded, letting the silence stretch. The hum of the vending machine filled the gap. Somewhere down the hall, a mop bucket rolled over tile. "You've seen the clock stop before?" Jules shook his head. "Never. We dust around it. Calibrate the humidity sensors. It's part of the building, like it's breathing with us." Last night was different. Durant leaned forward. Different how? The guard hesitated, his gaze landing on a crack in the table's laminate. The first pause, I thought it was my head. Too much coffee, not enough food. The ticking just folded in on itself. No echo, no weight. Like someone had put glass over my ears. Durant jotted the phrase down. Glass over ears. And during the pause, Jules's hand twitched. Pressure. You ever stand near the stage at a concert when they cut the sound? That's sudden. He mimed a drop with his hand. It's like the air gets thick enough to notice. Was that every time? Jules nodded. Every time. 37 times. He hesitated. And sometimes there was something else. A shape, not moving exactly. Just there where it shouldn't be. Durant tilted his head. Describe it. Tall. Gray coat. Mid-length. Collar up. Hat maybe, but shadow could have made it look that way. The kind of figure you'd notice on a winter street, but not in here. Durant's pencil paused. You said he was in 2 places? Yeah. Once near the Denon stairs. Then, not even a minute later, in the Richelieu landing. No running, no shortcut. I've done that route. Takes 5 minutes if you're rushing. Jules looked up, eyes searching Durant's face. And this wasn't rushing. This was just appearing. The detective kept his voice even. Teleporting. Jules flinched. I know it sounds stupid. It sounds like you saw something you can't explain yet. Durant tapped the brass sliver in its sleeve. This stops the clock's heartbeat. Whatever's causing your pressure in the air, it's working at the same intervals. Which means it's connected. Jules finished for him, then frowned. But that doesn't explain He stopped himself. What? Jules looked almost embarrassed. The smell. Only a couple of times. Like hot metal. Not burning. Just that faint iron taste you get from a radiator that's been running too long. It was there when the clock paused, and gone when it started again. Durant scribbled heat trace, electromagnetic source, in the margin. Did you check the cameras yourself? I saw the blurs, Jules said. Same times as the pauses. I even walked into the gallery once right after one, thinking maybe I'd catch, I don't know, a draft, a ladder, anything. He stared into his coffee. Nothing. Just the rope on the floor and that empty space looking at me. Durant closed the notebook. You did the right thing writing it down. Jules's voice dropped. You think I'm going to lose my job? That depends on whether you keep telling me the truth, Durant said, standing. And whether you stop thinking this is about your job. It's about theirs. He nodded toward the invisible museum that loomed just beyond the lounge walls. Someone played with time last night, and time doesn't like being handled. If we're lucky, they left fingerprints. Valmont appeared in the doorway, holding a folder thick with service logs. Every clock restoration since 2000, as you asked, he said. Durant took it. Good. We're going to see someone who understands what's in here. Who? Valmont asked. A horologist named Henri Duval, Durant replied. If this sliver is what I think it is, he's the only one in Paris who'll recognize whose hands made it. He gave Jules a final glance. If you remember anything else, smells, sounds, shadows, write it down. Details are a kind of currency. Then he turned for the exit, Valmont at his side. Outside, the sun had cleared the pyramid, and the glass sent blades of light across the courtyard. Somewhere, the city's trains began their measured run through the underbelly of the streets, their schedules as precise as the marks on the brass strip in his pocket. Durant had a feeling that was no coincidence. Part 5, Numbers in the Silence. Henri Duval's workshop smelled like old brass and new coffee, a combination Durant had always associated with people who repaired time for a living. But before he could get there, Durant needed a different kind of analysis. Back at his office, a modest 2-room space above a stationery shop in the 9th arrondissement, he slid the museum's service logs to one side and opened a slim black laptop. The analyst he trusted most was already on call. Louise Marchand, a former telecom engineer with a gift for turning noise into patterns. She didn't bother with greetings. You've got timestamps? 37 of them, Durant said. sending over the clock stoppage log. The line went quiet for 20 seconds, except for the faint percussion of her keyboard. "Ha!" she said finally. "These look almost musical. Not the word I'd use. They're not evenly spaced," she explained. "It's like a syncopated rhythm, and each cluster matches." Her voice paused, then sharpened. "Hold on." Durant heard more typing, then the rustle of paper. Louise had a habit of printing transit schedules for her own strange projects. "You're not going to like this," she said. "Try me." Every single pause aligns, within a 3-second margin, to an arrival at Palais Royal Musée du Louvre station. All northbound trains between 1:14 and 4:58. Durant frowned. "Vibrations." She snorted. "That clock's case is practically armored. No way normal train rumble gets in, especially not through the reception hall's reinforced foundation. Besides, vibrations don't make numbers etch themselves onto a brass strip. What about electromagnetic interference? That's more plausible," she admitted. "A portable coil timed to the train's approach could piggyback on its electrical signature. The museum's security logs would see it as background noise from the metro. But," she hesitated, "to hit all 37 pauses, you'd need to move in sync with the schedule. Either someone rode those trains all night, or they had a way to mimic their EM fingerprint exactly." Durant pictured the man in the gray coat, appearing in different wings as if the building had corridors only he could see. "Riding the trains could also give them an alibi," he murmured. Louise's voice softened. "You think it's the same operator?" "I think it's someone who understands that the safest place to hide is inside a predictable pattern." Durant tapped the brass sliver in his pocket. "And they're using Paris's own heartbeat to cover their own." He could hear her smile faintly through the line. "That's why you called me Emile. You'll owe me lunch." "Put it on the clock," he said, ending the call. Two hours later, Durant was in the tiled warren beneath the Louvre. The Palais Royal Musée du Louvre metro station was a place most tourists passed through without thinking. Bright mosaics on the walls, a few art installations paying homage to the museum above. But to Durant, it was a map of rhythms. The hiss of brakes, the chime of doors, the soft tremor of steel through steel. The station chief, a wiry man with hair like iron filings, recognized Durant and waved him into the control booth. "Heard about your missing friend upstairs," he said, meaning the painting. "What's the metro got to do with it?" Durant kept his voice mild. "I'm looking for a man in a gray coat who was here last night. Possibly rode multiple trains before midnight." The chief frowned, then called up surveillance footage. The grainy black and white frames showed commuters stepping off trains, lingering on platforms. At 23:52, a tall figure in a gray coat moved into frame, head down, hands in pockets. His walk was unhurried, but his timing, Durant saw now, was exact. He reached the platform edge just as a train slid in. Durant leaned closer. "Rewind. Play the next train's arrival." 017. Same man. Different platform. The chief clicked again, 042, then 114. Each time, the man was positioned like an actor hitting his mark. "Odd thing," the chief said. "Every time we try to zoom his face, the image blurs. Not the usual compression. More like the lens caught a glare from nowhere." Durant didn't need to be told it was the same distortion that crippled the museum's footage. "You have timing records?" The chief handed him a printed schedule. The arrival times lined up perfectly with the brass etchings in Durant's evidence sleeve. It wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. As Durant left the booth, the next train's arrival sent a low vibration through the tiled floor. He imagined a coil hidden in a satchel, calibrated to sing the same frequency as the metro's hum. Above ground, the Louvre's clock would falter, cameras would blink, and in that pocket of stolen time, a man in a gray coat could be anywhere and nowhere. Durant knew he was getting closer, not to catching the man, but to understanding his rhythm. And once you understood the rhythm, you could decide where the music stopped. Part 6: Shadows on the Platform. The Palais Royal Musée du Louvre station was always brighter than Durant thought it should be. Light here wasn't like the warm spill of cafe windows or the hazy amber of Paris street lamps. It was sterile, deliberate, reflected off glazed tile until every corner seemed in focus. That made it harder for shadows to exist, and yet that was exactly what Durant was looking for. He stood on the central platform, coat collar turned up against a draft that didn't belong to the season. The air smelled faintly of brake dust and copper. Above the muted chatter of morning commuters, he could feel the city's underground heartbeat, the distant percussion of trains entering and leaving, each one ticking against the schedule like clockwork. The station chief had given him a narrow window, 3 trains before midnight last night. Durant watched the recording again on his phone, frame by frame. The man in the gray coat didn't push through crowds or hesitate. He walked as if he knew exactly where to be when the doors hissed open. Durant glanced down the platform. No trace of him now, but that didn't matter. Patterns weren't about who was visible. Patterns were about the spaces left behind. 2 transit officers arrived, carrying a portable monitor linked to the station's camera feeds. One cued the clip from 2352. Durant's eyes followed the gray coat onto the train. The feed jumped to 017, different platform, same man stepping out. Blurred face, indistinct hairline, but the coat, wool mid-length with a stitched vent at the back, was the same. At 042, he was on yet another platform, again just before a train arrived. And each timestamp matched one of the 37 stoppages on the Louvre's clock. 3 different lines, 3 different directions, one officer muttered. You'd have to sprint, take service corridors, and break a few laws of physics to pull this off. Or, Durant said quietly, you'd have to make the laws pause for you. He studied the distortion in the man's outline, too uniform to be motion blur, too persistent to be lighting. It was the same interference pattern as the museum footage, a haze that ate detail, as if the camera's lens was fogged from the inside. Durant stepped closer to the monitor. Do we have anyone else on camera at all these stops? The officer checked. Only a few repeat faces, but they're commuters. Nothing stands out. Durant knew why. The man in gray coat wasn't avoiding surveillance. He was bending it. If the EM interference that froze the Louvre's pendulum could be tuned to the metro signature, then it could also corrupt video data without tripping alarms. To the system, the distortion was just part of the background hum of Paris itself. And yet, there was something else. Durant rewound the 042 footage, slowing it down. Just before the train entered, the man's posture shifted, not in reaction to the train, but as if anticipating something elsewhere. Durant turned to the station chief. Does this platform have any structural connection to the Denon wing? Old maintenance shafts, disused tunnels. The chief frowned. Some service corridors were sealed decades ago, but there's one, runs near the old ventilation ducts. You'd need clearance, but if you had it, you could get within 20 meters of the museum's substructure. Durant filed that away. 20 meters was nothing with the right equipment. As he left the platform, the next train's arrival sent a thin vibration through the soles of his shoes. It felt almost like the heartbeat of the brass pendulum under the Louvre's reception dome. A beat that could be stilled, if you knew exactly when to press. The man in the gray coat wasn't just moving with the trains. He was hiding inside their schedule, using the predictable noise to cover each step. And Durant suspected the real choreography didn't end here underground. It reached up through the stone and marble of the Louvre, touching its clocks, its cameras, its locked glass cases, until a painting could vanish as quietly as a shadow slipping between trains. Part 7: The Café Envelope. Durant preferred meetings with Camille in public spaces, not because he didn't trust her, but because she thrived on the theater of being seen. A quiet conversation in a private room made her restless. A whispered exchange in the corner of a Paris café made her feel alive. That morning, Le Petit Ascot on Rue de Richelieu smelled of butter and burnt espresso. Steam rose from the milk wand in thin ribbons, curling into the light. At the far end of the counter, Camille sat with her back to the door, a cream scarf draped like an afterthought over one shoulder. She didn't look up when Durant approached, only slid a folded newspaper across the table as he sat. "You're late," she said, tearing a croissant with deliberate care. "You're early," Durant replied, unfolding the paper. Tucked inside, between the pages, was a thin auction catalog from a private sale house he knew well, Bellegarde and Phil's. One page was marked with a neat crease. Lot number 112, Mona Bellini, the same painting now missing from the Louvre's Renaissance Gallery. A small red stamp read, "Withdrawn." Durant's thumb traced the margin. A faint pencil sketch had been added there. The outline of a tall pendulum clock, its brass face half-shaded, its base rendered in quick, confident lines. Camille sipped her coffee. "That came from a friend who owes me nothing and fears everything." "Name?" Durant asked. "No," she leaned back, letting the clatter of cups and plates fill the space between them. "But they don't move in the art world. They move around it. The kind of person who can walk into a place like the Louvre and see where the real walls are, the ones no blueprint shows." Durant looked again at the sketch. The proportions were exact. Whoever drew this had stood in front of the Louvre's reception hall clock long enough to commit its every detail to memory. "You think your friends saw something?" Durant asked. "I think they know something," Camille said. "And I think they're terrified you'll confirm it." Durant flipped to the front of the catalog. Bellegarde and Phil's didn't usually deal in stolen work. They were too careful for that, which meant the Mona Bellini had been scheduled for legitimate sale, until someone pulled it, fast, and made sure no record of the transaction would ever surface. "You noticed the timing?" Camille asked. He did. The catalog's print date was 2 weeks before the Louvre theft. Too soon for coincidence. He folded the paper, tucking it into his coat. "I need a horologist," he said. Camille raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought you needed a drink. This clock," Durant tapped the margin sketch, "isn't just a detail. It's part of the method." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile she used when she knew more than she'd say. "Then you'd better find someone who can read the language of its heartbeat." Durant rose from the table. Camille didn't turn to watch him leave, but her voice followed him through the clink of porcelain and hiss of the espresso machine. "Careful, Émile. When you listen too closely to a clock, you stop hearing everything else." Part 8, Master of Time. Henri Duval's workshop sat above a shuttered bookbinder's on Rue de la Verrerie, the kind of address you only found if you already knew it was there. The stairs groaned under Durant's weight, as if disapproving of his haste. The door bore no sign, only a brass keyhole with filigree worn smooth by a century of use. Durant knocked twice, waited, then once more. From inside came the sound of something winding down, the slow exhalation of gears surrendering their stored energy. Henri opened the door in shirt sleeves, spectacles perched halfway down his nose. His hair was white and thin, his hands darkened with the permanent stain of brass dust. "Émile," he said, eyes flicking to the coat pocket where Durant's evidence sleeve rested like a kept promise. "It's been 2 years? You've finally come to pay for the clock I repaired." "Not exactly," Durant said, stepping into the room. The workshop was a living museum of timepieces. Wall clocks with painted faces stared down from every angle. Carriage clocks lined the workbenches like soldiers awaiting orders. The air was dry and faintly metallic, tinged with the sweet musk of machine oil. Somewhere, a dozen different pendulums swung out of sync with one another, creating a rhythm so complex it felt accidental. Durant set the brass sliver on the central bench. "Tell me what you see." Henri picked it up with tweezers, turning it over as if it were a coin he was unsure about spending. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Custom escapement shim. Brass, high-quality alloy, hand-scribed intervals." He peered closer. "Not recent work. This was made by someone who understands the patience of old clocks." "Could it stop a pendulum without damage?" Henri smiled faintly. "If you know where to place it and when to breathe, yes. A piece like this would rest against the escapement's pallet fork, catching it just enough to freeze the beat. No wear marks, no bent teeth. And if you paired it with the right magnetic pulse." "Microcurrent?" Durant asked. Henri nodded. "A coil small enough to hide in a coat pocket." Brief pulse to hold the shim in place, another to release it. The trick is timing it so the security systems think it's background interference. Durant took that in. 3 clocks in Paris were built with this kind of escapement. One's in the Louvre. Where are the others? Henri ticked them off on oil-stained fingers. Claire Montreuil's private gallery in the Marais. Antoine Bechet's collection in Montmartre. He gave Durant a knowing look. And before you ask, yes, both have had visitors recently. Visitors. Henri set the shim down carefully. A man calling himself Rinaldi serviced Claire's clock last month. Paid in rare gold francs, collector's currency. Asked questions about guard rotations. He shrugged. Too curious for a repairman. Durant felt the name settle in his mind like a weight he'd been carrying for years. Rinaldi, he repeated. Henry's expression sharpened. You know him? By reputation, Durant said. And if he's here, it means this wasn't a one-night job. Henri leaned back, crossing his arms. Be careful, Émile. A man who plays with time this way doesn't fear deadlines. He creates them. Durant slipped the brass sliver back into its sleeve. Then it's time I got ahead of his schedule. Part 9, The Dealer's Hesitation. Claire Montreuil's gallery was one of those quiet jewels in the Marais district. No flashy sign, just tall windows veiled with cream curtains, and a brass door handle polished to the point of vanity. Durant had been here before on unrelated business, and he remembered the way Claire curated not just her pieces but the air itself. Faint sandalwood incense, low light that made every surface glow, and silence so deliberate it bordered on performance. She greeted him in a charcoal wrap dress, her silver hair pinned in a precise twist. Émile, she said, her voice measured. You only come when something is wrong. Something is, Durant replied. Your clock. Her smile was polite, but her hands, always immaculate, fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. What about it? It's one of 3 in Paris with a custom escapement, Durant said. Henri Duval tells me it was serviced recently. The hesitation was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a half-second pause before she nodded. Yes, a gentleman named Rinaldi. Italian, I think. Tall, well-spoken. He knew his craft. What did he do? Cleaned it, adjusted the balance, left it running smoother than it had in years. Her eyes drifted toward the far end of the room, where the clock stood encased in mahogany and glass, its pendulum catching the lamplight in slow arcs. He paid in unusual currency. Durant waited. Gold francs, she said. Old ones, minted before the Great War. Beautiful coins, almost too perfect to have been in circulation. Durant filed that detail away. Gold was both a currency and a message in certain circles. Did he ask you anything unusual? Claire hesitated again. He asked about the museum. Which museum? The Louvre, of course. Specifically about security patrols, guard shifts, and which parts of the building were accessible during night maintenance. I told him I didn't know because I don't. But he seemed satisfied. Durant walked to the clock. Its face bore the soft patina of age, the numerals slightly worn but still elegant. He opened the lower panel and scanned the escapement. Henri had been right, the mechanism was near identical to the Louvre's. If Rinaldi had handled this, he'd know exactly how to manipulate its twin. Claire, Durant said, closing the panel. Do you still have the receipt for his work? No, she said, then glanced toward a desk drawer. But I might have his card. She retrieved a small rectangle of cream cardstock. The printing was minimal. Rinaldi and Company, Horological Services. No address, no phone number. Just a single line at the bottom. By appointment only. Durant turned it over blank. He slipped it into his notebook. As he left, Claire's voice followed him. Émile, you think he's dangerous? Durant paused at the door. Not in the way most people mean it, but for him, danger is just a kind of precision. Outside, the narrow street was slick with last night's rain. Somewhere far off, a clock chimed the half-hour. Durant had the name. Now he needed the pattern. And if Rinaldi was as methodical as Durant suspected, that pattern would already be in motion. Part 10, an old pattern. Durant's office always seemed quieter after rain. The street outside glistened with puddles that reflected the lamps, and the distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt had a strangely soporific rhythm. He liked it this way, muted, as though the city had agreed to hold its breath for him. Tonight, he needed that stillness. The name Rinaldi was already echoing in his head before he reached his desk. It wasn't a name you heard often in Paris, not unless you worked in certain circles where paintings vanished and never returned, or returned wearing someone else's face. Durant booted up the secure terminal on his desk, the one with access to the Direction Centrale de la Police Judiciaire's restricted archives. It wasn't the Louvre's databases he wanted. It was the record of thefts the public never heard about, the ones whispered about over espresso in Interpol conference rooms. He typed the name slowly, like pressing on an old bruise. Rinaldi. The search bloomed into a short list, just 4 confirmed entries spanning 15 years, for thefts for different countries. But the similarities hit him like a pendulum swing to the ribs. Entry 1, Venice, 2008. Gallery dell'Accademia. A 17th-century seascape by Luca Carlaveriges vanishes during a renovation. The only anomaly in the security logs. The gallery's century-old clock stopped 8 times between midnight and 3 a.m., each pause lasting precisely 7 seconds. Entry 2, Vienna, 2011. Conspiracies Museum. A jeweled altarpiece disappears. The hall's ornate astronomical clock reported 13 stoppages that night, 7 seconds each. Surveillance feed showed minor distortion exactly during those pauses. Entry 3, Madrid, 2016. Museo del Prado. An unsigned Goya sketchbook disappears. Clock in the central hall froze 12 times. Guards reported a faint metallic tang in the air during each pause. Entry 4, Brussels, 2019. Royal Museums of Fine Arts. A 15th-century Flemish triptych disappears. 12 pauses in the main hall clock. Blurred figure in a gray coat appears in multiple camera angles within impossible timeframes. Durant leaned back, fingers steepled. For jobs in 4 cities, each separated by 2 to 5 years. Different items stolen, different security systems breached. But the method was identical. It wasn't a MO you stumbled upon by accident. It was a signature. He opened the incident photos from Venice, zooming in on the clock face. Brass rim, worn enamel numerals. The escapement mechanism's shadow was barely visible behind the glass. A twin to the Louvre's reception hall clock, different maker, same century. Vienna's was more elaborate, all gold leaf and celestial markings, but beneath the ornament, the same precision movement. Madrid's clock was simpler, less ornate, but still, Durant's pulse quickened. Every one of these clocks was more than a timekeeper. They were chosen because their escapements could be manipulated without leaving visible damage. Rinaldi wasn't just stealing art. He was stealing time, in pockets carefully measured out and hidden within the noise of the world. The Brussels file held a blurry still of the gray-coated figure moving across the museum's grand gallery. Durant enlarged it, expecting the usual nothing. But something caught his eye. On the man's left hand, just above the glove line, was a pale scar in the shape of a crescent. He closed his eyes, letting the memory surface. A briefing in Florence years ago, when he was still a junior inspector. They had been looking for a man involved in the disappearance of an Etruscan bronze. The suspect had escaped a rooftop chase, leaving only a description from a witness. Tall, gray coat, scar like a crescent moon on the left hand. Back then, the name had been whispered, unconfirmed. Now, the files gave it weight. Durant began cross-referencing dates. A pattern emerged, not just in the method, but in the timing. Each theft occurred within months of an unconnected, high-profile art auction somewhere in Europe. The stolen piece never appeared on the market, but Durant suspected the auctions were distractions, pulling security resources and attention toward more obvious targets. In every case, the targeted museum housed a clock of a particular design. Durant pulled up Henri Duval's registry of historic Paris clocks and circled the last 2, Claire Montreuil's in the Marais and Antoine Bechet's in Montmartre. Claire's had already been serviced. That left Bechet's. Antoine Bechet was an old guard collector, the kind who never sold anything unless the buyer came wearing white gloves and carried a name worth more than the currency. His Montmartre residence was a converted townhouse, all wrought iron balconies and shuttered windows that looked down on the street with suspicion. Durant called ahead, invoking Henry's name. Bechet agreed to see him reluctantly. The collector's drawing room smelled of cigars and varnish. Heavy curtains muted the afternoon light, casting the room in a permanent amber dusk. In the corner stood Bechet's clock, taller than Durant, with a face of tarnished silver and a pendulum shaped like a narrow teardrop. "It stopped twice last week," Bechet said without preamble. "I thought it was the weather." Durant's gaze flicked to the clock's base. The dust around the panel was disturbed. "Recently. Anything else unusual?" Bechet nodded slowly. "A man came to buy it. Called himself Rinaldi. I told him it wasn't for sale. He smiled, said he understood, and left. 2 days later, my shipment ledger from the 1890s went missing." "What kind of ledger?" "One that recorded my grandfather's acquisitions, including, I believe, a certain Mona Bellini." Durant's mind turned over the implications. If Rinaldi had the original transport records for the painting, he could be building a claim, not to sell it, but to return it under his own terms. That fit the whispered rumors about a restoration thief who stole only works with contested ownership. And yet, Durant knew from the other cases, noble motives and criminal methods made dangerous company. When he left Bechet's home, the rain had started again, soft against the cobblestones. Durant pulled his coat tighter. Rinaldi wasn't improvising. He was following a cycle, a rhythm that had played out across Europe for more than a decade. But now the tempo was accelerating, and Durant had a feeling the Louvre job was just the opening note of a longer composition. Part 11, Ledger Gone Missing. Montmartre always felt like a place caught between paintings and reality. Narrow streets wound between sloping staircases, cafe terraces clung to corners like they'd grown there, and the air carried the faint tang of wine, rain, and street music. Durant had always liked it, until now. Today, the hilltop quarter felt less like an artist's haven and more like a stage set with too many curtains. Antoine Bechet's townhouse was exactly as Durant remembered from years ago, when he'd attended a private showing here. Tall shutters painted in faded teal, brass door knocker in the shape of a lion's head, and a stone stoop polished by decades of careful feet. But the man who opened the door this time was not the warm host of those gallery nights. "Durant," Bechet said, his voice clipped. "Henri Duval told me you'd call, but I didn't think you'd turn up this quickly. I find it's best to see a scene before the dust settles," Durant replied. The drawing room smelled of age, leather, wood polish, and the faintest ghost of cigar smoke. The walls were hung with landscapes and portraits from 3 centuries, but Durant's attention went straight to the tall clock in the far corner. Its silvered face gleamed faintly in the gloom, the pendulum slicing a slow arc in perfect time. "Stopped twice last week," Bechet said, noticing his gaze. "2 nights in a row. I assumed it was humidity. This house is moody when the weather turns." Durant stepped closer. The clock's casing was immaculate, but the thin line of dust along the base had been disturbed, as if someone had opened the panel recently. "You serviced it?" Bechet shook his head. "No. The only one who touched it was a man who came to buy it. Tall, well-dressed, Italian accent. Rinaldi, he said his name was." Durant kept his expression neutral. "Did he make an offer?" "A generous one, but I told him it wasn't for sale." He smiled politely and left. 2 days later, Bechet's voice hardened. "My 1890s shipment ledger was gone." Durant straightened. "The ledger? What did it contain?" Bechet crossed to a sideboard and opened a drawer with slow precision. He pulled out a small notebook, modern, lined paper, clearly a reproduction, and set it on the table. "I've tried to reconstruct it from memory, but the original was far more detailed. It listed every acquisition my grandfather made between 1889 and 1895, including provenance notes, original shippers, customs clearances." Durant flipped through the replica pages. "And the Mona Bellini?" "Yes, shipped from Florence in 1893. The notes were ambiguous. Something about disputed inheritance, a claim filed but not pursued. Bechet's eyes narrowed. You think this is why he took it? I think, Durant said slowly, that Rinaldi doesn't take anything without knowing exactly where it came from and where it was meant to go. They sat in silence for a moment, the slow tick of the clock filling the space between them. Bechet leaned forward. Do you know what kind of man he is? Durant considered. The kind who sees theft as correction, who believes he's restoring balance, not breaking the law, and the kind who doesn't mind if that belief costs other people their peace. Before leaving, Durant asked to see the clock's back panel. Bechet hesitated, then fetched a key. Inside, the movement was pristine, but Durant's trained eye caught the faintest brass smear on the palette fork. Henry's words came back to him. A piece like this could freeze the beat without leaving a mark. Durant closed the panel, feeling the subtle vibration through the wood as the pendulum kept its slow, steady pace. Mr. Bechet, he said at the door, keep your clock under lock for now. Rinaldi may not come back for it, but I wouldn't bet against him. Outside, the Montmartre streets glistened in the drizzle. The city felt alive with quiet possibilities, each shadow holding the weight of a man in a gray coat. Durant turned up his collar and headed for his car. The ledger's disappearance meant Rinaldi now had more than just a method. He had the paperwork to make a case for taking the Mona Bellini. Whether the law would side with him was irrelevant. In Rinaldi's mind, the decision had already been made, and Durant suspected the next move wouldn't be in Montmartre. It would be back under the Louvre's glass pyramid, in the archives where the museum kept its own history and its own secrets. Part 12, Words in the Ledger. The Louvre's archives lived 2 floors beneath the tourists' awe, down past service corridors where the walls grew practical and the floors turned from marble to cement, down where the museum remembered itself not as a temple, but as a warehouse of memory. Durant signed in at the security desk, surrendered his phone, and clipped a visitor tag to his lapel as if it could possibly confer belonging this deep below ground. The archivist on duty was a woman in her 50s with hair like graphite shavings and a cardigan the color of old parchment. Her name tag read Mireille. She looked at Durant the way people who keep records look at people who want access to them, courteously, but with the assumption that whatever he asked for would not be enough. You're looking for acquisition documents relating to a Mona Bellini, she said. After scanning the request, Valmont had fired off ahead of him. Oil on panel, late 15th century. That's the one. Durant kept his tone soft. Down here, soft traveled farther than loud. Mireille slid a ledger toward him across the desk. The covers were buckram, the color of midnight. Duplicates, she said. We never handle originals unless necessary. The 19th century manuscripts have been digitized, but you'll want to see the margins. Scanners flatten what the hand intended. She led him into a reading room that smelled of climate control and string. Tables were spaced as if for an exam no one could cheat on. A task lamp threw a clean, limited circle of light onto the page as Durant opened the volume. The duplicate ledger's modern paper carried exact facsimiles of ink that had once bled and dried and cracked. Durant read the neat copperplate entries the way he listened to a witness, for where confidence faltered. March 1893, shipment from Florence. One painting attributed to Mona Bellini.
Carrier, la Compagnia Marittima.
Received in Paris under customs certification. Beneath, a second hand, smaller, had added a clarification in Italian lighter ink, years newer, Provenienza contestata. Contested provenance. He turned the page. The curator notes from the 1920s tried to turn doubt into certainty. Attribution strengthened by stylistic analysis. Provenance adequate. Academics with ink for blood. Durant had spent enough time in universities to know certainty was just fear with better grammar. May I? He asked Mireille, gesturing for gloves. She brought him a pair, then watched, not unkindly, as he leaned closer to the reproductions. The facsimile margins bore scribbles that hadn't made it into the typed catalog. Names crossed out, shipments reweighed, crates relabeled when a patron's donation needed to look cleaner than it was. There, Mireille said, tapping with a capped pen. The phrase you want. In a slanted hand, squeezed into a margin as if the writer feared being noticed, was a line of Italian. Restituire al legittimo proprietario quando il debito sarà pagato. Return to rightful owner when the debt is paid. Durant felt the phrase land somewhere behind his sternum. It had the rhythm of a pact reached in a hallway rather than a courtroom. He translated quietly, and Muriel's eyebrows depressed a millimeter. "We don't translate marginalia," she said, which was the sort of policy that felt like ethics and smelled like self-defense. "What debt?" Durant asked, not really expecting an answer. Mireille exhaled. "In the 1890s, she said, shipments often passed through intermediaries who were flexible about paperwork. A contested estate in Florence. A nephew who believed the painting belonged to him by right. A patron in Paris who believed the Louvre could give the work what the law could not. Safety and prestige. We were," she amended herself. "They were sometimes the city's conscience, sometimes its fence." Durant turned the leaf again. A receipt for crating. A letter thanking an unnamed donor for facilitating the work's transit during a period of legal uncertainty. He saw the same phrase appear in 3 languages. Legal uncertainty was a phrase museums used when they kissed a ring and took the ring anyway. "Is there a file on the contested claim?" he asked. Mireille consulted a terminal, fingers moving with the speed of someone who had refused to let younger staff turn her into a ghost. "There is an index entry," she said, "but the physical folder is," she frowned, "checked out." "By whom?" "Legal department." Her mouth made a shape between a smile and a complaint. "For a week. No return logged." Durant looked up at the ceiling where the building above them pretended to be a cathedral. "Of course," he said. He asked for the accession card file next, a cabinet of white cards the size of prayers. The one for Mona Bellini bore a typed line, received 1893. Florence. Gift via intermediary. Under conditions, someone had typed, pending resolution of claim. The word pending had been struck through twice. Beneath it, in pencil, resolved 1895. But there was no indication of how. "Do you know the name Rinaldi?" Durant asked, casual as a shoulder. Mireille pursed her lips. "In the 19th century context? Several. A family of framers. A minor art dealer who moved between Florence and Marseille. A customs agent dismissed for irregularities." "What about now?" She lifted a hand, palm side to side. "We have a volunteer docent named Rinaldi in the Richelieu wing on Thursdays. Too small to be your thief." Her glance was not unkind. Archivists traffic in irony and coffee, not suspects. Durant returned to the ledger. He traced the hand that had written return when the debt is paid. The line was repeated again, 2 pages later, near a list of transit insurance premiums and an invoice for fumigation of a crate shipped during a cholera scare. The kind of bureaucratic paper a thief's mouth wasn't supposed to know the taste of. Rinaldi, he thought, hadn't just known the clock. He'd known which room held the papers and which margin remembered the promise. "May I see the outgoing correspondence for March 1893? He asked. Mireille sighed, then smiled faintly, betrayed by her better nature. "You may see the box. Whether the box lets you find anything is between you and its ghosts." She disappeared into a rolling stack and returned with a gray archival container bound with cotton tape. Inside, folders fanned like ribs. Durant lifted one labeled Florence, intermediary correspondence. Typed letters, onion skin paper thin as rumor. He found the name Bichet, the grandfather, his loopy French heavy with enthusiasm, thanking the intermediary for expediting access to a difficult object. Another letter, and signed, acknowledged receipt of a discretionary fee. He could hear Camille's voice in his head. They don't move in the art world. They move around it. He found, near the bottom, a sheet torn from a ledger, Italian script more hurried than the marginalia.
Debito annotato. Custodia fino a restituzione.
Debt noted. Custody until restitution. "Tell me about loans between 1893 and 1910, Durant said. "Was the Bellini ever lent back to Florence?" Mireille shook her head. "No loans to Florence recorded. There was a loan to a Paris salon in 1904. After that, the painting remained in storage during the war. Transported to the Louvre in 1939. She paused. The rest you know. He did. A crate in a school basement, mice and saints for company. War survival had a way of laundering provenance emotionally, if not legally. The public loved art that had survived. It made theft sound like sacrilege rather than audits. Durant's pen scratched. Rinaldi's claim equals moral theater? Legal threat? Both. He flicked a look at the clock in the reading room, an institutional thing that measured researcher shifts and humidity cycles and nothing that mattered. What are you really asking? Mireille said, surprising him with the directness of someone who'd grown tired of polite questions. Whether your institution said pending and meant never, Durant replied, and whether someone grew up with that word stuck in his family's throat. Mireille allowed the smallest of nods. The Louvre is very good at waiting out other people's certainty, she said. We tell ourselves that time clarifies. Sometimes it only makes things harder to pry open without breaking. Durant closed the ledger. If someone felt a promise had been made, to return the painting when a debt was paid, what would paying look like? A settlement, she said. A donation, perhaps. A return of other works. An apology that meant nothing and everything. She tilted her head. Or a theft if one belonged to the wrong century. He half smiled. Wrong centuries had a way of stacking on top of each other in the city until floors creaked under their mutual weight. He signed the call slip for copies, then pushed his chair back and let his eyes rest for a moment on the tidy grid of the reading room. Lamp circles, linen gloves, the calculus of custody. The museum's heart beat even down here, a dull, regulated thud. Above, a clock had stopped 37 times to let a man move unseen. Below, a sentence written in a margin had refused to reach a period. On his way back to the sign-out desk, a courier, a kid in a museum polo shirt with a tempo like caffeine, stepped into the hall from the staff elevator and glanced around as if looking for a name tag to match the envelope in his hand. Excusez-moi, the kid said, catching sight of Durant's visitor badge. Detective Durant? Durant paused. That's me. The kid held out a thick cream envelope sealed in red wax. No return address, just A. Durant written in a precise hand. The wax seal impressed with something too blurred to read from a distance. Not a lion, not a clock, something like a compass rose missing a point. Who gave you this? Durant asked. The courier shrugged, apologetic. Left at the staff entrance. No one saw. It was just there. Durant took the envelope. It was heavier than appearances suggested. He waited until Mireille had retreated graciously behind a partition, then cracked the seal with a thumbnail and slid out a single item. A metro ticket, stamped for tomorrow's date and a time that lived like a nerve in his memory. 1:14. Folded inside the ticket, a strip of paper. A line in English, for once, as if to ensure no nuance was lost. Listen when the ticking stops. There was no signature, but the handwriting repeated itself from memory. The same restrained italics from the brass sliver. Confident, allergic to flourish. Durant refolded the note with care and slid it into his wallet, where it lay like a thin blade. When he looked up, the corridor lights seemed fractionally too bright. The room hummed with climate systems. Somewhere above, a tourist laughed too loudly. The world kept moving, obedient to the tyranny of seconds. Down here, a promise made in the dark asked to be kept. Durant thanked Mireille, took his copies, and rode the elevator up into the museum's main arteries. The pendulum in the reception hall cast a thin gold arc. He listened both to it and past it, to the idea that someone else was listening too, and would be there at 1:14 to test whether Durant had learned how to hear. He buttoned his coat. Schedules were a kind of trap. He planned to bring one of his own. Part 13, Invitation by Timetable. The rain had stopped by the time Durant left the Louvre, but Paris still wore the scent of it. Stone rinsed clean, gutters murmuring softly, air sharpened by the night's wash. Street lamps threw coins of light onto the slick pavement as he crossed the courtyard toward his car. The metro ticket in his pocket felt like a small, living thing, the stamp time 1:14. pressing against his thigh like a heartbeat. He'd seen traps dressed as invitations before. They often came in the form of something innocuous. A dinner menu, a library call slip, a theater program. Rinaldi, if it was him, understood that. The ticket was more than a lure. It was a clock face without the clock, daring Durant to show up when the hands aligned. He stopped first at his apartment, a second-floor flat above a bakery in the 5th arrondissement, where the scent of yeast and coffee always seemed to soak into the floorboards. Durant poured himself a small glass of Armagnac, sat at his desk, and laid the ticket in the center of a blotter. Around it, he arranged the brass sliver, the photocopy of the ledger margin, and his notes from Bechet's townhouse. The pattern was there if you squinted: pauses in time, movement through blind spots, a signature written in seconds instead of ink. The previous thefts had all relied on predictable disruptions. Train arrivals, mechanical anomalies, calculated gaps in surveillance. The Louvre job had refined it to art. Rinaldi wasn't just telling him where to be, he was telling him when. And if Durant didn't go, he'd spend the rest of his career chasing the ghost of whatever happened in that gap. By 2230, Durant was at the precinct's Special Investigations Office, a squat building with too many locked doors and too much fluorescent light. Captain Moreau was not pleased. "You're walking into a performance," Moreau said, flipping the ticket in his hand as though it might confess. "He's baiting you. Public place, yes, but time to the second? That means he's controlling the stage." Durant shrugged into his coat. "Then we make sure the stage is ours, too." They went over the plan. 2 plainclothes officers at the Palais Royal Musée du Louvre metro platforms, 2 more covering the surface exits. Another pair would be inside the Louvre itself, near the reception hall. Durant would move between the station and the museum, ready to follow whichever way the wind shifted. Moreau leaned back, studying him. "You think he'll show?" Durant thought of the ledger's margin, the brass sliver gone from his pocket, the scar in the blurry footage from Brussels. "He's already here," he said. By 0:45, the metro station felt like a set with no audience. A few last trains rattled through, disgorging night shift workers and the occasional pair of clubgoers still laughing through their fatigue. Durant stood near the ticket barriers, the stamp on his own pass matching the one Rinaldi had sent. His earpiece crackled softly. "North platform clear," came a voice. Another, "Surface exit, nothing yet." At 1:10, the rumble of a train in the tunnel vibrated through the tiles. Durant's fingers brushed the brass in his pocket. Not the missing sliver, but a small pocket watch his grandfather had carried, its glass faintly scuffed. He clicked it open, watching the seconds hand sweep toward the mark. 1 hour, 13 minutes, and 50 seconds. He stepped through the barriers, moving toward the Denon Wing exit that connected the station to the museum's underground concourse. The train's brakes screamed briefly, then sighed into silence. 1 hour and 14 minutes. Somewhere above, the Louvre's reception hall clock stopped. The sound didn't reach him, but he felt it, the way one feels the air shift before a storm. The lights in the corridor flickered once. His earpiece hissed. Gallery lights just dipped. North corridor. Durant quickened his pace. The concourse was nearly empty now. Just a man in a scarf buying a newspaper from the all-night kiosk, a janitor mopping tiles in slow arcs. The air felt thicker, the faint metallic tang Jules had described. He emerged into the Louvre's lower hall. From there, the staircase to the reception chamber loomed ahead. Durant took it 2 steps at a time. As he reached the top, the light steadied, and a figure in a gray coat slipped through a side service door without looking back. "Visual on target," Durant murmured into the mic. "Moving west, staff corridor." The figure moved with purpose, coat swaying slightly, boots silent on the polished stone. No rush, no hesitation, just enough speed to suggest he already knew the outcome. Durant followed, keeping his distance, counting the turns, right past the restoration rooms, left by the climate control vents. The faint hum of machinery was the only sound. The corridor opened into the reception hall. The great pendulum stood still, its brass bob fixed in mid-arc like a captured breath. The man in the gray coat approached it, head tilted slightly, one gloved hand resting briefly on the glass. Durant moved closer, the weight of the metro ticket in his coat pocket suddenly enormous. "Rinaldi," he said. The man didn't turn. "You guard what was stolen," he said softly, the voice carrying just enough to reach Durant. "But you never ask what it cost to steal it in the first place." Durant stepped forward. "And you pay yourself in other people's debts." Rinaldi's reflection in the glass gave the faintest smile. "Debts are just time written in ink." A soft click came from somewhere in the pendulum's housing. Durant reached for him, and the lights went out. Part 14, the stakeout begins. Darkness inside the Louvre had a texture to it, thick, deliberate, the kind of dark that didn't just happen but was engineered. The moment the lights died, the great glass pendulum case became a faint mirror for the dim emergency strips along the floor. Durant froze only long enough to let his eyes adjust, ears filtering through the layered quiet. The far-off hum of backup generators, the muted tick of some smaller clock deep in an adjacent gallery, the near-silent shuffle of leather soles on marble. Rinaldi was moving. "Lights down, reception hall," Durant whispered into his mic. His voice felt swallowed by the air. From his right earpiece, "Copy, North team in motion." Then, "Durant, your west corridor just lost camera feed. That was no accident." Durant stepped forward, keeping low, tracking the faint gray silhouette as it slid through the staff side door at the far end of the hall. The emergency strips traced the outline of the corridor, but Rinaldi's coat seemed to drink the light. He passed into the service wing, narrower hallways, walls painted utilitarian white, punctuated by doors labeled in small brass plaques. Maintenance, electrical, climate control. Somewhere beyond these, the central security hub hummed behind armored glass. Durant's pulse was steady. Too steady. The darkness slowed time in ways the man ahead understood intimately. Every footstep was a tick. Every pause was a gap in which something could change. They emerged into the Denon Wing's inner service stairwell. Rinaldi took the steps upward without touching the rail, his pace unhurried. Durant followed 2 landings behind, the sound of his own shoes muffled by the thick treads. He knew the clock stoppages would be timed 37 before, now perhaps a smaller sequence, but still precisely engineered. He suspected they weren't just about halting time in a room. They disrupted power circuits, looped camera feeds, maybe even desynchronized radio signals. If Rinaldi had cut the lights here, then other parts of the museum might still be fully illuminated, giving the illusion of normalcy to the guards outside the affected sector. 3rd landing. Rinaldi stepped into another corridor, this one leading toward the reception hall from the opposite side. Durant caught sight of him pausing at a security junction box mounted halfway along the wall. A faint metallic click echoed in the stillness, followed by the softest vibration through the floor, like the pulse of a machine waking for an instant and then sleeping again. Durant's instincts prickled. That wasn't just clock tampering. That was access. He closed the distance, careful to keep in the shadows. "You're trespassing in more than one sense tonight," he called softly. Rinaldi didn't turn. "Trespass is such a crude word, detective. I prefer returning to where one belongs." The man resumed walking, slipping into the hall that overlooked the Louvre's central lobby. Below, the empty marble floor reflected dim pools of emergency light, the glass pyramid above them faintly silver in the moonlight. Durant could feel the shape of the chase forming. Rinaldi would loop back toward the reception hall clock, using his earlier approach as misdirection. The target wasn't an exit, it was the mechanism itself, the heart of his method. "South team, converge on reception," Durant ordered through the mic. "He's making for the clock." From below, a faint echo of boots joined the soundscape. But Rinaldi's steps didn't change. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man whose timing had already accounted for every obstacle. Durant followed him into the hall again, the pendulum looming in the distance, still frozen mid-swing. It looked less like an instrument now and more like a sentinel, keeping watch over a room where time had been told to wait. Rinaldi stopped beside it, one hand in his coat pocket. "You can close in now if you like," he said without looking back. "But you'll miss the point entirely." Durant advanced another 3 steps. "Enlighten me." Instead of answering, Rinaldi tapped the pendulum's case twice, almost affectionately. Then he murmured, "Sometimes, detective, you don't stop the clock to steal. Sometimes you stop it to give something back." The words landed with a strange weight, half confession, half dare. Durant shifted his stance, preparing to close the gap, and that was when the blackout hit. The entire Denon wing plunged into pitch darkness. The emergency strips snuffed out along with everything else. Somewhere near the pendulum, there was a sound like metal kissing metal. Durant moved forward quickly, hand brushing the edge of the clock's case. But the spot where Rinaldi had been standing was empty. Reception hall, targets gone. From the east side, a guard's voice in his earpiece. No sign of him in the corridors. He's just a pause. Gone. Durant turned back toward the pendulum, heart still steady but heavier now. Something was missing, not just Rinaldi, but from the case itself. He reached into his coat pocket. The brass sliver was gone. In its place was only the faintest trace of cold against his fingertips, as if the metal had been replaced with the memory of itself. Part 15, Blackout in the hall. For a moment, Durant stood still, the pitch black pressing against him like a physical weight. In the absence of light, the Louvre's reception hall became an unfamiliar organism, breathing differently, shifting in ways his eyes couldn't follow. The soundscape sharpened. Somewhere in the high vaults above, the building gave a slow, settling creak. Far off, the faint metallic whine of an elevator's brake system carried through the walls. Closer, within arm's reach, he could hear the minute ticking of smaller clocks somewhere in the adjoining galleries, each one oblivious to the grand pendulum's frozen pose. And then, footsteps, not hurried, not panicked, a measured cadence, each step landing as though on a conductor's invisible beat. Durant turned toward the sound, hand brushing the edge of the pendulum's glass case. He moved slowly, deliberately, his own footsteps falling between Rinaldi's as if trying to read the man's rhythm. Somewhere in the darkness, Rinaldi's voice floated, clear, quiet, without echo. "You guard what was stolen," he said, "but never ask what it cost to steal it." Durant kept moving, following the sound. "And you think taking it back makes you even?" A pause, then the faint scrape of a shoe pivoting on marble. "Even? No, detective. Balance is not a scale. It is a clock, and this one owes me 36 more seconds." There was a sharp metallic click, followed by a subtle hum, like the electric charge in the air before lightning. Durant realized the sound was coming from the pendulum's housing, something engaging or disengaging deep inside. He lunged forward, hands sweeping through the darkness. Nothing, only the cool, smooth surface of the glass. The blackout didn't end in a flicker. It ended all at once. Overhead lights roared back to life, blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, the pendulum's brass bob was swinging again, slow and steady, as if it had never stopped. And Rinaldi was gone. The only trace of him was an open service door on the far side of the hall, its brass pushplate still rocking slightly from a recent touch. "Reception hall to all teams." Durant barked into the mic. Suspect exited east service door. "Lock down all adjoining wings." The reply was immediate but grim. "Negative. No visual anywhere in east corridor. Cameras show static during your blackout." "He's gone." Durant strode to the service door, scanning the corridor beyond. Empty, silent, undisturbed except for a faint draft that smelled of machine oil and cold stone. He'd been in enough old Parisian buildings to know what that meant. Hidden ventilation shafts, maintenance tunnels, century-old conduits never mapped on modern plans. As he turned back into the hall, something else caught his eye. The pendulum case. He stepped closer, scanning the housing, then reached instinctively for his coat pocket. Empty. The brass sliver, his single piece of physical evidence from the clock, was gone. Taken without him noticing, as cleanly as a signature removed from paper. It had been there when the blackout began. And now, Durant exhaled, slow and steady, his breath clouding faintly in the lingering chill around the clock. The man hadn't just vanished. He'd taken back what Durant had taken first. A closed loop. Somewhere in the building, The generators hummed into their steady rhythm, and the Louvre's security system rebooted. The monitors would come back online, guards would return to their stations, tourists would arrive in the morning none the wiser. But Durant knew what had happened here tonight wasn't just a failed capture. It was a conversation, one conducted in darkness with seconds as the currency. And if Rinaldi's claim was true, 36 more seconds would have to be bought or stolen before their time together was over. Part 16, The Forger's Secret. Paris was gray by the time Durant left the Louvre, the early morning light still thin and reluctant. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove across the river to Belleville, where the streets still felt damp from last night's rain, and the smell of baking bread from corner boulangeries fought with the tang of exhaust. Camille's call had come just after dawn, her voice carrying that mix of urgency and self-satisfaction she got when she knew she was first with information. "Your ghost in the gray coat," she'd said. "He's been paying visits to a man who lives above an old watchmaker's shop. Name's Lucien Favre, an artist, the kind who paints for people who can't afford to be caught buying what they want." "Art forger?" Durant had asked. "Among other things," Camille replied. "If you're quick, you might catch him before he sells his latest piece." The building was easy to miss, faded blue paint peeling from wooden shutters, the narrow shop below its windows long since closed. Inside, the air was heavy with the mingled scents of turpentine and dust. Favre himself answered the door in a paint-smeared shirt, his hair sticking out like he'd been sleeping in it for days. He was wiry, with sharp features and the kind of restless energy that made you think he might bolt at any moment. "Detective Durant," he said before Durant could introduce himself. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Durant stepped inside without being invited. "You've been expecting me?" Favre gave a half-smile and gestured toward the far corner of the room. It was there, under the muted light of a single overhead bulb, Mona Bellini, or rather a version of her. The colors were fresh, almost too fresh, the varnish not yet fully cured. The face was perfect, every delicate brushstroke of the original captured in maddening fidelity. Only the faintest irregularities in the canvas weave, and the scent of recently ground pigments, betrayed that this painting was younger than it looked. Durant studied it without touching. "A copy," Favre tilted his head. "A forgery," he corrected. "A copy is what you make to learn. A forgery is what you make to fool." "And the Louvre's painting?" Favre's eyes flickered with something. "Guilt, or pride, or both." "Swapped 2 nights ago. The one you saw hanging in the Renaissance Gallery yesterday morning is mine." Durant took a step closer. "You did this for Rinaldi?" Favre laughed softly. "No one does anything for Rinaldi. You do it because he asks, and because he already knows what you owe." "And what do you owe him?" "Time," Favre said simply. "But in my case, I was allowed to pay in paint." The forger crossed to a cluttered workbench and pulled a sheet of paper from beneath a pile of brushes. On it was a rough sketch of the Louvre's great pendulum clock, annotated with faint pencil marks, angles, distances, and notations in a shorthand Durant didn't recognize. "His timing is everything," Favre said. He needed to know exactly how long the lights would be down, how far the nearest guard would be, where the blind spots overlapped. "I just had to make the painting." Durant folded the paper once and slipped it into his pocket. "Where's the real one?" Favre didn't hesitate. "Still in Paris. He told me it would be safer here until his negotiations were over. Said you'd find it if you were willing to climb for it." Durant frowned. "Climb?" Favre smiled, but it was tired, as if he'd been carrying the answer too long. "There's an old clock tower in Belleville, long abandoned, except for the pigeons and the rain. He likes places where time is kept but not watched. If you go there, you'll see what I mean." "Why tell me this now?" Durant asked. "Because," Favre said, leaning back against his workbench, "he told me you'd come here, and that if I gave you the wrong answer, you'd know." Durant stayed another 5 minutes, asking questions Favre answered in half-truths and shrugs. When he finally left, the air outside felt cleaner, sharper. The street sloped upward toward the hill, and in the distance he could just make out the silhouette of the Belleville clock tower against the morning haze. It was leaning slightly, like an old man listening to a secret. Durant buttoned his coat and started walking. Part 17, the clock tower hideout. Belleville's old clock tower had been dead for decades. Its face, once white and luminous, was now the color of dirty bone. Its black hands frozen at 20 minutes past 6. A moment no one remembered and no one seemed to care about. Durant had seen it before, from a distance, on his rare visits to this part of the city. Up close, it was even more of a ruin. Cracked stone, flaking mortar, weeds pushing from between the joints like stubborn survivors. The street leading to it was narrow, the kind where shadows clung even in daylight. The last cafe had closed 2 blocks back, and now the only company was the distant rattle of a passing metro train and the restless flapping of pigeons roosting under the eaves. Durant approached the door, a warped slab of oak, iron hinges eaten with rust. The padlock hanging from it looked newer, but only just. He slipped a thin tool from his coat pocket, worked it into the mechanism, and felt the pins shift with a satisfying click. Inside, the air was cool and heavy, tinged with the scent of rain-soaked wood and something metallic, old machinery, perhaps. Light filtered in weakly through a few narrow, dust-filmed windows, tracing pale beams through the gloom. The first floor was empty except for discarded crates and a collapsed wooden bench. But in one corner, near the base of the staircase, he saw the telltale signs of recent activity. A faint scuff mark in the dust, the imprint of something heavy having been dragged across the floor. The staircase spiraled upward, its steps creaking under his weight. Durant took them slowly, every sense tuned to the faint noises above, soft rustles, the occasional tick of metal expanding and contracting with the change in temperature. Halfway up, he paused. Through a gap in the boards, he could see into the second floor. Work tables covered with scattered brass fragments, lengths of wire, tiny precision tools. The remains of a disassembled clock mechanism lay like a dismantled skeleton, its gear teeth catching the dim light. It wasn't just a hideout. It was a workshop. Durant stepped onto the second floor and scanned the space. On one table lay several sheets of paper covered in diagrams, metro maps, marked in red ink with times and arrows, photocopies of the Bechet ledger, handwritten columns of numbers that matched the stoppage times of the Louvre clock. Pinned to the far wall was a large photograph of the reception hall, annotated with circles and lines. At the bottom, in neat script, was written, "Pauses are doors. Time is the key." He continued upward, the air growing cooler as the tower narrowed. The wind whispered through cracks in the stone, carrying the faint scent of rain from outside. At the top, the staircase opened into the belfry. The great bell loomed overhead, silent, its bronze surface mottled with age. Beneath it, on a wooden table, sat a weathered leather satchel. Durant approached cautiously. The bag was heavy when he lifted it, the contents shifting with a soft rustle. He opened the flap. Mona Bellini, the real one. The canvas seemed to draw the light toward it, the colors warmer and deeper than the forgeries. Even under the dust of its concealment, the painting radiated a quiet power, the way true art always does. Durant's chest tightened, not with awe, but with the weight of what this meant. He had it. The investigation could be tied up in hours. But the fact that it was here, waiting, suggested that this was only another move in a game whose board he still didn't fully see. And then footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind him. "You found her too soon," said a voice he knew. Durant turned. Rinaldi stood in the shadow of the bell, hands empty, expression unreadable. The gray coat looked almost black in the dim light. "Too soon for what?" Durant asked. "For the story to be finished," Rinaldi said, "and for you to decide whether you're part of it or just a man who closes doors." Part 18, confrontation at the top. The air in the clock tower belfry was thin, laced with dust and the faint tang of oxidized metal. Durant let the satchel's leather flap fall closed, the weight of the Mona Bellini settling back into place like a held breath. Rinaldi stepped forward into the gray morning light filtering through the tower's slatted shutters. His face, unmasked for the first time since this chase began, was lined but not weary. eyes sharp, like someone measuring the depth of a wound rather than its length. "You've been chasing a thief," Rinaldi said. "But the crime happened before either of us was born." Durant didn't move. "The painting was stolen from the Louvre 2 nights ago. That's the only fact that matters to the law." "To your law," Rinaldi corrected. "The one that pretends history is a locked cabinet, and whoever holds the keys gets to decide what's inside." The wind pushed against the tower, sending a hollow moan through the bell's housing. Durant adjusted his stance, keeping one hand free at his side. "You think taking this back erases what happened in 1893? Rinaldi's gaze flicked toward the satchel. "It doesn't erase it, corrects it. My family, Florentine merchants, owned her. The Bellini was part of a private collection cataloged before Italy's political unification. Then came the acquisition, on paper perfectly legal. In truth, a fraud signed off by men who knew the war would hide their theft." "You have proof?" Durant asked. "I had proof," Rinaldi said, his voice lowering. "In Bechet's ledger. That was the last missing link. Shipment records, dates, customs clearance. All pointing to one thing. The Louvre's claim is built on a foundation of lies." Durant kept his tone even. "Even if that's true, this isn't restitution. This is a personal operation carried out in the dark." Rinaldi's mouth curved faintly. "And the daylight courts would have done what? Listened to a name with no surviving witnesses. A family with nothing left but a memory? No, detective. In daylight, history is written by the winners. In the dark, you can still take back what was stolen." They stood in silence for a moment, the muted tick of Durant's pocket watch almost mocking in its steadiness. Below, the distant vibration of a passing metro train rippled faintly through the floorboards, and Durant saw the corners of Rinaldi's mouth twitch. "You timed even this," Durant said. Rinaldi nodded toward the scattered diagrams on the lower table. "Time is the only true weapon. It opens doors others don't see. Every pause, every blind second. It's all an invitation to move while the rest of the world hesitates." "And what about the others?" Durant asked. "The museum guards, the collectors, the people whose lives you pass through and leave shaken. They are the cost," Rinaldi said simply. "Nothing worth restoring comes without one." Durant stepped closer, just enough to feel the faint change in the air between them. "You've perfected your method. 37 stops in one night. But you slipped, you left traces." "I left breadcrumbs," Rinaldi corrected, "because I wanted you to find me. You were always going to." Durant's jaw tightened. "Why?" The older man's gaze held his. "Because you understand that truth isn't just a fact in a file. It's a story. And I'd rather the right detective hear this one before they bury it again." The rumble of another train drifted up from the city, and Durant knew the moment was closing. Somewhere below, his team would be moving into position. Rinaldi's eyes flicked toward the staircase. Just once, just enough to confirm what Durant already suspected. "Last chance, detective," Rinaldi said quietly. "You can take me in, and the Louvre will have its painting back before anyone can ask the wrong questions. Or you can let me go, and I'll finish what I started." Durant said nothing, but in the corner of his vision he caught the faintest shadow of movement on the stairs. Moreau's men closing in. Rinaldi smiled faintly, as if he'd seen it too. "Time's up," he murmured. Part 19, Arrest in the Tower. The creak of boots on the spiral stairs was the first sign, faint but unmistakable. Rinaldi's eyes didn't flick to the sound. He didn't need to. Durant knew the man's sense of timing was too precise not to have accounted for it. From the shadows beneath the bell, Rinaldi exhaled slowly, like a man about to step into water he'd been staring at for a long time. "And now," he said, "we finish." Durant took half a step to his right, placing himself between Rinaldi and the satchel on the table. "It ends here." The gray-coated figure tilted his head, considering him. Then, with the faintest shrug, he extended his hands. Palms outward, fingers relaxed. No struggle, no dash for the stairs. The first officer emerged into the belfry, weapon drawn, eyes darting between the two men. Moreau followed, his breath steady but edged with tension. "Rinaldi," Moreau said flatly, "you're under arrest for the theft of the Mona Bellini and for interference with National Museum security systems." Rinaldi turned his gaze back to Durant as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "You're certain you've arrested the right man?" Durant didn't answer. The officers began guiding him toward the stairs. He didn't resist, but his voice carried easily back up to Durant. 36 more, detective. That's what the clock owes me." The words landed like the echo of a gunshot. Durant looked once more at the satchel, the painting inside still wrapped in its protective cloth. The game, because that's what this had been, should have felt over. The primary suspect in custody, the stolen object recovered. But there was no satisfaction in the air, only that lingering awareness of how easily Rinaldi had chosen to be caught, and how little he'd done to prevent Durant from finding the clock tower. Felt staged. At the bottom of the tower, the morning light hit them in cold silver bands. A police van waited at the curb, its rear doors yawning open. Rinaldi stepped inside without prompting, settling onto the bench like a man boarding a train he'd been expecting all along. Before the doors shut, he lifted his eyes to Durant. "The clock's ticking," he said softly, almost kindly. The doors closed. The van pulled away, its engine fading into the hum of the waking city. Durant stood for a moment in the chill, watching the street empty. Then he turned back to the tower, the satchel secure in his grip, and started toward the car. Somewhere, in the silence between the swings of a pendulum, there was still something he hadn't heard, and he had the gnawing suspicion that Rinaldi had made sure of it. Part 20 Restitution Debate. The Mona Bellini returned to the Louvre under the kind of security escort usually reserved for state dignitaries. Uniformed officers flanked Durant as he carried the satchel through the Denon wing, the museum still closed to the public. The reception hall felt strangely neutral. No trace of the blackout, no sign of the night's pursuit. Only the steady tick of the restored pendulum clock filling the air like a polite reminder that time had moved on. The painting was inspected under white gloves and archival light. Experts whispered over pigment analysis, canvas tension, microscopic brushstroke comparisons. The verdict came quickly. Authentic, undamaged, as if it had never been gone. But outside the examination room, the real battle was just beginning. The museum's board convened an emergency session in the curator's office. The long oak table gleamed under the harsh glow of antique brass lamps, papers and legal briefs spreading like an invading army across its surface. Valmont opened the meeting with his jaw tight. "As far as the French Ministry of Culture is concerned, the theft is resolved. The painting is ours, as it has been for over a century." Across from him, a silver-haired man in an impeccably tailored Italian suit adjusted his cufflinks. He represented the descendants of the Florentine family Rinaldi had named, and his voice was calm but sharp. "Yours in display, perhaps, not in truth. This was taken from my clients under circumstances the museum has conveniently never examined." Durant leaned against the wall near the door, saying nothing. This was no longer his arena, yet every word circled back to the questions Rinaldi had planted. An art historian from the University of Bologna presented archival documents hinting at irregularities in the Louvre's acquisition records from 1893. The French legal counsel countered with wartime treaties and statutes of limitations, their tone brittle with the effort of confidence. In the hallway, a handful of reporters waited, sensing the kind of cultural scandal that could ripple well beyond Paris. Valmont glanced at Durant during a pause in the arguments. "Detective, perhaps you can confirm, did the suspect offer any legitimate proof of these ownership claims?" Durant chose his words carefully. "He offered context, not proof. The only document I saw was the Bechet ledger, which was stolen from a private collection before the Louvre theft. The pages I recovered are now in evidence." "And do you believe," pressed the Italian lawyer, "that the ledger supports our claim?" Durant's gaze was steady. "I believe it supports that there's more to the story than we've been told." A murmur moved through the room. By late afternoon, the session adjourned without resolution. The painting would remain in the Louvre's possession until the ministry could conduct a formal review. a process likely to take months, if not years. Durant left the meeting and crossed the nearly empty reception hall. The pendulum clock swung in perfect rhythm, its brass face catching the pale winter light. To anyone else, it was a reassuring sight. To him, the ticking had weight. Each swing seemed to carry the echo of Rinaldi's voice. 36 more. That night, Durant returned home to his apartment in the 11th arrondissement. He poured himself a glass of brandy and sat by the window, watching the lights of Paris smear across the wet streets below. He should have felt the closure that came with a solved case. But the rhythm of the city seemed to beat in time with the pendulum. Even here, away from the Louvre, he couldn't shake the sense that time was no longer entirely his to measure. Part 21, the 36th to come. Durant's apartment was quiet, save for the low hum of the radiator and the steady tick of his mantel clock. It had belonged to his grandfather, walnut casing, brass bezel, the kind of timepiece that asked to be wound by hand. He'd grown used to its sound over the years, the rhythm so constant that he hardly heard it anymore. Tonight, though, the ticking was louder, or perhaps it was only his attention, sharpened by the day's debates, the lingering weight of Rinaldi's words. He sat at his desk, a case file open but unread, the glass of brandy untouched beside it. Then, without warning, the clock stopped. The silence was startling, dense, absolute. Durant glanced up at the brass hands, frozen mid-minute. The pendulum hung perfectly still. He checked his watch. 7 seconds passed. Exactly 7. The clock resumed, the ticking sliding back into the room as though nothing had happened. But Durant's gaze had already shifted to the edge of his desk, where something lay that hadn't been there before. A sliver of brass, identical to the one Rinaldi had taken from him in the Louvre. Durant picked it up slowly, feeling the cool weight in his palm. There was a note folded beneath it. Plain paper, no envelope. 36 to go. No signature, but the handwriting, sharp and deliberate, was the same as the annotations on the diagrams in the clock tower. Durant set the note down beside the brass sliver. His eyes lingered on it for a long moment before he leaned back in his chair, the ticking of the mantel clock weaving into the hum of the Paris night beyond his window. Outside, the city went on unaware. Cars hissed over wet asphalt. A metro train rumbled beneath the street, and somewhere in the distance a church bell marked the hour. But Durant heard only the ticking, and beneath it, faint as a breath, something that wasn't quite the sound of time, but the promise of its interruption. Paris keeps its secrets well, my friends. Behind the velvet ropes and marble corridors, the truth ticks quietly, waiting for the right moment to stop the clock again. Tonight, we've walked with Detective Émile Durant through shadows and silence, chasing a man who claims justice wears many faces. We've seen a painting returned, and a warning left behind. 36 to go. What does it mean? Perhaps it's a countdown. Perhaps it's a promise. Or perhaps it's already begun again, somewhere neither of us can see. Thank you for keeping me company in these late hours here at Somnolent Conspiracies. If you've enjoyed tonight's story, I invite you to linger a little longer. There are more cases to uncover, more whispers to follow. Subscribe, share the tale with a fellow night wanderer, and keep your ears open when the ticking fades.